Thank you, Neil. I'm gonna, this thing fit up here?
No.
Doesn't look like it.
No, we have a corded one that's not here.
All right, so I'm gonna try to figure out how to do this one-handed. The whole purpose today is not to come and entertain you. That may disappoint some of you, but my purpose really is to have a challenging dialogue, and hopefully we can do that. I'm gonna give you some facts that I bet none of which will surprise you. So, but listen, please keep on eating, those of you who are still eating. I want to cover an obvious fact, oil insecurity. Most people want to talk about oil security in the world and the United States specifically, but I want to talk about and point out some things about insecurity involved with oil. Now, as I said, I could stand here and lecture you on that topic. I'd rather give you some facts. We'll run through this fairly quickly because I've always found that it is far more important for us to have a dialogue together than an opportunity just for me to tell you what I think and then walk out the door. So I'll get to this fairly quickly. And I want to encourage you to ask any and all questions. Now, the questions can include this topic. They can include anything about my previous engagements with the United States Air Force, Navy, Army, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, all that sort of stuff. Anything about general officership. Anything you'd like to get off your chest or ask me today, I encourage you to do that. It's just wide open. If there's media in the room, you'll get the honest to goodness version of John Handy today then. Otherwise, it'd be highly constrained. So let me just give you some facts. But we're going to get down to the Q's and A's, and I can't tell you enough how much I want to hear your questions because that helps me respond to what you're really interested in. Does anybody doubt the fact that oil dependence threatens our national security? Just raise your hand. All right, there's one person that says there's no threat of oil to our national security. The rest of you maybe didn't understand the question. If you think that it does not affect our national security, look what's going on in the Middle East today. Does anybody believe that we'd have had the Gulf War or anything since then if we weren't dependent upon oil? You'll raise your hand again? The reason we're in that part of the country and engaged is certainly dependent upon our desire for oil, driven primarily by our transportation system, not by our own personal vehicles. Look at the last 18 months, 24 months, as you look from just ignore Afghanistan and Iraq engagements. Look at what happened in Libya. Look what happens in Egypt, Syria, all of North Africa, back into the Middle East. And every time there is the just slightest involvement with something in the Middle East, watch what happens to the price of oil. And you can see it happening today. In the last month, regular gas on average in the United States has gone up about 25 cents a gallon in 30 days. And that's just because of what's happened primarily in Egypt and the Suez Canal. But the world is a very emotional world we live in. So our threats to national security are certainly dependent upon oil price. Here's another good fact for you. The best estimates indicate the skyrocketing price of gasoline at the pump cost Americans $104 billion in 2011. That's just the price of gas at the pump. It cost us $104 billion compared to the prices we paid in 2010. Now here's another thing that really got my attention. The payroll tax exemption netted us, all taxpayers, about $108 billion. So if the price of oil at the gas at the pump cost us $104 billion in a year, and the net of our payroll tax exemption is $108, should be no question in anybody's mind about why we have a stagnant economy if you just isolate it down to the price of oil and what we're paying for gas. Instability certainly has accelerated in 2012 with supply outages all the way across, as I said, Sudan, Syria, Yemen, Colombia, the North Sea, and Canada have all seen price instability and oil instability. That instability removed more than a million barrels of daily global oil supplies from the market. Just the hiccups in those markets I ticked off. I should also mention the Iranian situation. Every time we have any kind of issue nationally or internationally with the Iranian nuclear situation, the price of gas goes up. And we see it getting even tougher right now with the Israeli strike in Syria and the Syrian and the Iranian response to that strike. If we look on the 12 years that we've been engaged in Afghanistan and Iraq, from my perspective, think of the consumption of oil. If you just discount the loss of lives and the cost of war, if you just look at the consumption, air, land, and sea, of oil supplies in an oil-rich part of the country, do you know that we actually ship oil, refined fuels, back to the Middle East so we can use it? You would think that we're over there and it would be refined and we would use their own. We do not. We take our own gas, oil, all fuels back to that part of the world so that we can use it in our military. Consider the young person. This is close to home for me. Consider someone, a young person who joined the military, any of the services in 1990. For 23 years of their lives, their deployments have been uniquely back and forth to the Middle East. Not one other place in the world. And in my 39 years in uniform, I was deployed all over the world. It was just, one place after another, from Vietnam through to Afghanistan and Iraq. But our young people in today's military have spent their entire careers back and forth between the United States predominantly and the Middle East. That's a staggering fact when you think about our involvement in that part of the country, the world. Now, how about some national security implications directly? Ask yourselves, as I mentioned earlier, about Iran. We'd be focused on the Iranian nuclear situation no matter what was going on with the price of oil and availability of oil. But every time there's a little hiccup in the headlines, our price of gas at the pump tends to trend up. And you see that especially over the last month. Would we even be in the Middle East, as I said to start out my comments? I think not, were it not for the fact that we're so dependent upon oil, even as we produce our own. The cost to U.S. and American lives lost is immeasurable. There's no question about that as we've been engaged over there. But listen to this. A RAND study from 2009 estimated that we as Americans are spending between $67.5 billion and $83 billion annually for our conflicts in the Middle East. Now think about that. And the Mitre Corporation, I was on the board of trustees with them, is not a conservative organization, not a liberal organization. It's an honest go-to think tank, and I trust these numbers, but just the thought that we spent approximately $80 billion in that endeavor is a killer to me. Another point, there's no silver bullet on gas prices and no quick fix on energy security. There's nothing that we can snap our fingers and say we'll have electric cars and don't worry about oil. The truth is, our insecurity with regards to oil is dependent on much greater cooperation. It's a huge challenge. When gas prices spike, we can't find a cure right then. We have to focus on what can be done in the long term to protect our nation. And we need to somehow, my plea, and I think you all would agree, break the stranglehold that oil has as the only solution to our energy needs. Somehow we need to do that. Here's an interesting fact. Domestic crude oil output reached an 8-year high in 2011. Not that long ago, an 8-year high in 2011. This fact is a sharp departure from the conventional wisdom just a few years ago that we've seen in the media that suggested crude oil production was in a decades-long state of decline. So in 2011, we are producing more than we had in the previous 8 years. There are additional benefits to this fact. Reduction in our trade deficit and increased employment in the energy sector are some of the positive results. And you won't see a lot of this in the news, but think for a minute that there have been roughly 38,000 jobs in the extraction-related activities created just between 2007 and March of 2012. Almost 40,000 jobs in that sector alone. And that's in spite of the fact that the pipeline from Canada, their shale supplies, has not yet been put into fact. We certainly hope that would happen. Now, another point, real energy security must be comprehensive, lasting, and bipartisan. Anybody disagree with that thought? Now, trying to get a bipartisan approach to anything in this nation right now seems to be out of the question, but let's hope that we could rally around something as common to all of us as the price of gasoline at the pump. We must improve fuel economy in all aspects of how we use it. It's interesting to me that we have tended to focus the nation on hybrid cars, electric cars, and not against that. But the greatest consumer of fuels in this country are our transportation sector. That's where the consumption is, and that's the difficult challenge that we face. The volatility is also a threat. Just the fact that I mentioned at the start that the price of oil at the pump has gone up almost 25 cents in 30 days. I can tell you, I live near the South Carolina border, and we go 5 minutes away to fill up down there at 30 cents cheaper a gallon than folks here in North Carolina pay. I was born and raised in Raleigh. I'm a tried and true North Carolinian, but when it comes to the hip pocket, I'll, like most people, go where I can to save a little bit of money. Look at Canada and Norway. Canada is one of the world's largest producers of oil out of shale. Norway, with the North Sea crude, produced huge volumes of oil. They pay the going price for a barrel of oil, in spite of the fact they're producing enough to supply a great bit of the rest of the world. The point is, producing oil does not save you price because of the volatility of the oil. The oil market is set as a global price. A barrel of oil is set globally, that price, so it's not up to us to produce our way out of it any better than what we see in Norway and Canada. So energy security is based on less oil dependence rather than on increased oil production. Now, I mentioned the fact that we're producing more, but the price is going up. So the truth is, production of oil is not what saves us money at the pump. It's trying to think of other ways to use energy that saves us. Now, there are other key points. Factors outside our ability to control can induce instability in the price of oil. How simple is that? Instability outside our control causes things to go wacko at the pump. There's no free market for oil. Something going on behind me here? I don't know.
There's offices upstairs.
Maybe they're listening. There's no free market for oil. I think this may be the most significant challenge that we face. Free market dynamics genuinely reel in prices. But oil is one of the unusual commodities in the world that is not subject to free market pricing. More than 90% of all proven oil reserves are held by national oil companies, either fully or partially controlled by foreign governments. Over 90% of those oil reserves are controlled by someone outside the United States. Here's some critical facts. Whip these off very quickly for you. The U.S. is the world's largest consumer of oil, accounting for more than 20% of the entire global demand. Now, I confess to you that China is right on our heels, but we are the largest consumer of oil. We consume roughly 20 million barrels of oil each and every day. 20 million barrels of oil a day. That's our cars, our trucks, trains, aircraft, the transportation sector. Americans spent $895 billion, that's with a B, on petroleum fuels in 2011, or about 6.1% of our entire GDP. Just think what oil does to this economy. The transportation sector in the U.S. accounts for 70% of the total oil that's consumed in this country. At 13.5 million barrels per day, our transportation sector alone consumes more oil than any national economy in the world. Our transportation sector consumes more oil than any other economy in the world. American cars, trucks, planes, and ships rely on oil for 93% of their fuel with no readily available substitutes. Every American recession over the past 40 years has been preceded by or occurred concurrently with an oil price spike. Every single recession. Now, a lot of people want to blame this latest recession we're still suffering through as home mortgage crisis. If you just look back at the impact of oil on all of us, every single recession of the last 40 years has been preceded with an oil price spike. And I'm afraid we're seeing more and more increase in that price of oil as we read the paper every day. In 2011, the U.S. trade deficit in crude oil and refined products reached $327 billion. That's the U.S. trade deficit. or 58% of our entire U.S. trade deficit. In 2001, the average U.S. household spent $1,755 on gasoline. That's 2001. I think $1,755. By 2008, the figure had increased to $3,760. The cumulative impact of the Bush tax cuts from that same time period, 2001 to 2008, increased the average household income by $1,900. Gasoline wiped out the entire impact of the tax cuts. In 2011, the average household spent a record $4,059 on gasoline. That's equal to 8.2% of the median household income. How much more can we stand as a nation? U.S. oil production in 2011 was 709,000 barrels per day, higher than in 2008. That's almost, just roughly averaged out 700,000 barrels more in just the difference between 2008 and 2011. Basically, high oil prices and highly improved drilling technology increased U.S. oil companies' ability to want to go out and find it, produce it, get into shale. So the price has gone up, but it hasn't changed the price at the pump. And it hasn't changed our thirst for fossil fuels. So the key question that we could start off the dialogue is, where do we go from here? The best policies, I think, are those that focus on reducing our exposure to oil price volatility. How could we increase the stability of price of a commodity that we all use? Our policies should also support growth in domestic production by recognizing that a new American oil boom, frankly, is poised to benefit the economy in numerous ways. Now, I'm not suggesting, and in this conversation, that we ignore electric, wind, solar, or any other form of energy, but none of those to date power our thirst for oil, our own personal vehicles, large American cars, trucks, SUVs I'm guilty. I drive an SUV. I sold a pickup truck and bought an equally big SUV. I'm as guilty as anybody, so I'm not preaching to the choir here. I'm just suggesting that somehow, as we look to the future of this country and our dependence on oil and the insecurity that it gives us and the cost in our sons and daughters, never mind the tax dollars that go into protecting our oil interest and supply chains in that part of the world. What can we do as a nation to change what we are stuck with? So with that, I'd like to entertain any and all questions on this topic or anything you would like to entertain until Richard waves his hand and says we're done.
You emphasized Norway and Canada as two very successful economies due to their source of oil, but you said it did not affect the price of oil.
That's true.
Okay. Now you said that the increased production in the USA is a good thing. So it's not going to increase the price, but it will increase our security.
The key is exactly as you caught it. Our insecurity is based on needing someone else. Look at our dealing with Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, because we use a considerable amount of Venezuelan oil. We don't like him, but we haven't done anything about it. We can't afford to. Our involvement in the Middle East. Essentially, my entire 39 years in the Air Force involved some degree of support to something going on in the Middle East. And it goes all the way back to Roosevelt and the King of Saudi Arabia. You know, secret agreements way back when, we'll protect you if you provide us. So our dependence on oil as a security blanket has left us involved in places in the world we would like not to be. So the discussion today is not on price at the pump so much as it is our oil dependency leads to insecurity. The more we could produce at home, the more secure we could be. If we could wean ourselves off of foreign governments and foreign-owned and controlled oil companies, the better off we'd be as a nation. Believe me, I'd like nothing more in my lifetime to look at somebody in the Middle East and tell them, build sandcastles, because I don't care what's going on. I mean, that's
we seem to have plenty of natural gas. Why don't we go and use that for transportation?
Interesting you mention that. We are, in a small way. We've experimented even in the military with transfer vehicles, some vehicles using natural gas. It's the same somewhat situation as electric cars. Until the nation embraces new technology, that we build charging stations and natural gas refueling stations, then we're not going to get there. There's some other problems with the technology still with natural gas. Higher altitude, we put them at the Air Force Academy, and they had trouble driving around a mile high. So there are some issues. There's a company that's just announced they've signed a contract to build LNG-powered ships, very large ships. It's a significant challenge, but they will be able to do that. The technology is there. It's a little easier, frankly, for a ship because of refueling capability around the world. But there's some serious technical challenges to the transportation sector to convert to a liquid gas powered vehicle. It's not undoable, but the nation has to embrace the technology to do it. Yes, sir.
Thomas Friedman wrote "The World is Flat" that Japan and China, and to a small degree India, are buying the futures of the oil production out of the Middle East. Are they still buying the futures?
Well, I don't know if it's a classic futures as the Chicago Board of Trade, but
No, they're buying inventory.
I know. What you find the Chinese especially doing, I think not so much the Japanese, but the Chinese are investing and buying capability of not just oil, but minerals all over the world. And so they'll buy up years worth of production for their belief that they're going to need it someday. And I mentioned in the remarks that China's right behind us in oil consumption. There are various predictions on how soon they'll pass us, but they will. And it'll be, my guess, look at the data, it's probably less than 10 years. So yes, they are. I think I've not seen anything on Japan for a long time. Other questions? These are boring questions. Come on. There's a challenge.
I was about to say, maybe I should wait. No. A few years ago, it's the last time I remember, there was an interruption to our gasoline supply here in Charlotte. I think there was a storm in the Gulf, and for some reason, this part of the country just could not get supplies, and that lasted for a couple of weeks, and it was a huge issue. Regardless if it was $4.50 or $5 a gallon, made no difference. It didn't exist. It wasn't there, and everything was closing down. My question is this. I've always heard somewhere in a mountain someplace there's an emergency supply of gasoline. That there was some talk about the president opening that up to take care. Is that true, and what's the deal on that?
It's almost like asking me about Area 51 out in the middle of nowhere. There's marches of the damnedest card players you've ever seen. It's not gasoline buried. It's oil. You take oil, you put it in the ground in caverns. I'm shocked you didn't know that. Most people do. It's there for real emergencies, and that term "real emergencies" can be interpreted by anybody, all of us, whatever comes to your mind. And so the president was urged to release some of that oil. Frankly, the problem is it should be a real national disaster to dip into that oil supply. The problem we had here in Charlotte was the pipeline to get the oil here was inoperative, and so you just couldn't get any kind of supplies to us, this whole region of the country. You saw the same thing happen after Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast. Price of gasoline at the pump shot up. It eventually ran out, but it was because of supply and demand, but the supply couldn't be delivered. And so I would suggest to you that I doubt very seriously that any president or any administration is going to dip into the national reserves unless there was a true national disaster of monumental proportions to last a long time. And fortunately, it didn't last here in Charlotte too long, but I mean, any time is too long if you drive.
To spin off of that question, even if they were to open up that reserve, how long would it take to actually produce anything to actually where we could actually use it?
Right. That's the biggest issue is refineries. And we lost another refinery to bankruptcy up in the Northeast within the last week. And so it's the refining of fossil fuels that is a significant challenge. And that is, as I mentioned, it's crude oil in the ground as opposed to gasoline. Yes, sir.
How quickly would you say the price of gas, or how soon is the price of gas going to double and stay there at that level? Or do you anticipate that?
You know, I left my crystal ball at home this morning. If I didn't, Lamar didn't tell me we had to predict the future here. I have no idea. I tell you, if you look around the world, the price of fuel at the pump for personal use, we're pretty lucky. I mean, we really are fortunate. But we also, as I said, consume more than anybody else on the planet. And so I just don't, I wouldn't predict anything. I don't have a sense that we're going to see some incredible price of fuel at the pump. I think there's it's not a glass ceiling, but I think there's a ceiling at around the $5 mark. And the Secretary of Energy announced this just while I was on the way here, that he's quitting the Obama administration, and he's the guy that wanted to see price at the pump $5 plus. So he's resigned. Maybe that means that it'll go away. I think $5 seems to be, if you saw, every time it gets $4 plus, people really start doing 32 molar sucks. I mean, they, you know, and that just kills the economy. Y'all not familiar with that term? How many of you from North Carolina? I can't believe that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I have a comment and two questions. One is about gas. I think we often complain about how gas rises, but when I look at my friends in Europe, it doesn't even compare. They're paying much more than we are. You might have something to relate to that. My two questions are, for the people that are opposing the pipelines that are going to the the middle of the United States from Canada, what validities, what valid arguments do you think those people have to stop that? I'm not saying that we should. I'm just trying to get the other perspective. And then also kind of a random question, with all this oil that we're taking from the ground that's being sucked up and being utilized, what's happening to the ground underneath this? At some point, is everything just going to cave in?
Yeah, we're going to collapse a little thing about the size of an 8-ball. You know, I took one course in geology in school, and I just for the life of me never had a question about sucking the lifeblood out of the planet Earth. So I can't deal with that. The first part of the question, I favor that pipeline big time for jobs and energy and a whole bunch of reasons. And it seems to be environmentalists, the same people whose mother and dad fought the Alaskan pipeline, which has proven to be a remarkable good deal for all of us in this country. And so I think we have to be prudent and we ought to care for the environment where we can, the technology and the engineering is possible today to do that without any harm whatsoever. And so I think if you just watch the way, I'm agnostic on politics, but if you just watch how Obama is sort of gradually working his way back to the pipeline, I think we'll see an approval, perhaps even this year, that, okay, let's get going. And, you know, the Canadians have got intense pressure on us. Members of Congress have really rallied behind the idea. So I think we'll, don't quote me, and again, there's no crystal ball, but just the sense of some of the comments, as you read carefully, look like we're getting really close to approval, which would be a huge jobs and energy boost for the nation. So I have no idea other than environmental tree huggers. God bless all of you here that hug trees every morning. I'm not against you, it's just I don't agree with a lot of that stuff. Who else? Hello. Okay.
What about what more use of nuclear energy can do?
You know, I certainly believe that we're missing an opportunity that we've not built more plants. But then you get into, you look at what happened in Japan, and I think it's a wake-up call for the plants on the West Coast. It creates a lot of concern about where you build these things. I mean, I can see the steam coming from the plant, it's probably 15 or 20 miles south of where we live. I think about it every time I see it, that, okay, it's there, and I hope everything's going well. So I think there are more concerns about nuclear than, let's suggest, as an alternative, coal. There is significant number, hundreds of years of coal resources in this country, and we've tapped very little of it. And it can be good, clean energy. Produces a tremendous amount of electricity. Now, we focused on oil as predominantly in transportation and vehicle issues here, but if we expand that thought to, as you have, nuclear power and nuclear energy in the country, then I would just come back and say, let's back off the environmentalist on coal and look at the energy that can be developed and what are the technologies that we use to clean stacks and things like that in the coal industry. So I encourage people to spend more time investigating that as an opportunity as opposed to nuclear. I'm a little bit goosey about what can happen. I'm concerned about Iran, even if they don't build a bomb, just building nuclear facilities, because earthquakes in that country are very common, and they don't have small earthquakes in Iran. They're horrible. And so, just think about what that would do to the world. So, who else? Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts on nuclear-powered merchant ships?
Well, the problem there is expense. I mean, it's in the tens of hundreds of millions of dollars. Life cycle cost. If you look at the United States Navy and what the Navy goes through for nuclear-powered subs, aircraft carriers, just to refuel one of those incredible systems is a monumental expense. Right now, just the price of bunker fuels for the shipping industry, which I'm extremely familiar with, just will drive you out of business. And the volatility is, you could sail from the U.S. to the Middle East and the price will change dramatically in a 30-day voyage. And yet you hope you don't have to bunker in the Middle East where it's all coming from. So if bunker fuels, which are, if you distill gasoline, diesel, you get it down to there's nothing left but tar, that's what we burn in our ships. You have to heat it up to make it liquid enough to even pump it in to burn it. It's junk, and yet the price per nautical mile is staggering. It's $25,000 to $30,000 a day every day you're at sea. And just the cost of running a ship. Here's a figure for you, not to bore you to death with personal problems, but if I launch a ship from the East Coast to the Middle East and back, it costs $5 million round trip. $5 million. That means every time you punch the go button, and they're going to go no matter what, you better have $5 million plus of cargo on board that thing there and back to even break even. So nuclear power aggravates that exponentially. Other questions? Anything? Yes, sir.
Somewhere I heard the percentage, I know with the military was the largest user, maybe it's airline, I'm not sure which, fuel in the country. Is that correct?
I get even more specific. The United States Air Force on the air side is one of the largest consumers of fossil fuels in the country. So if you didn't just add on the Army aviation programs and others, the Navy, then it gets extraordinarily expensive. And that is a fact. That's why you see the department looking at how we can use other alternative fuels or blends. And several of the major commands of the Air Force and Navy have blended fuels that work just as well as aviation fuel. So you'll see a lot of pressure to get with, it's not green, but it's hybrid fuels that are still fossil fuels, but much better than just burning JP5 or JP4.
The other thing, I was reading it wasn't the last few weeks, comment from someone on fuel, complaining about gasoline costs. Said, if gasoline goes up a quarter, then it's no different if you drive at 10 miles an hour faster. cost of additional mileage or reduction in gas mileage is endemic to the sun. And, we don't talk about how much of our economy goes to gasoline. A lot of that's collected on, most of it. I drive a Cadillac, my wife drives an Escalade. Neither one of them get very good mileage. I get good on mine, roads, that Escalade does. And that's her decision to drive there. And that's not, that Europe will be unthinkable because of gas prices.
That's why you see smart cars running around all over Europe. You don't see many of them. Maybe you own smart cars? I saw one caught between two pickup trucks. Richard, are we out of time, or are you going to play with that thing?
I'm just trying to keep up with you.
All right, well, how about if I do this?
About 2 more minutes? No problem.
Anybody else? Any topic you want to discuss? Lamar?
What do you see happening on the drawdown of our military?
Boy, you said 2 minutes, didn't you? I tell you.
That's crystal ball too.
Well, no, this is fact. If we allow sequestration to take place, and if you've been reading the paper or watched the news, you know what I'm talking about. That's the automatic spending cuts against the Defense Department and social programs. I can argue that even the cuts in social programs are going to be a disaster to Americans. I'm more concerned about the hits in the DOD. I can assure you, this is not emotion, I can assure you that we'll go from the world's top military in all phases of our Department of Defense to one of the worst on the planet if we do what's planned March 2nd. It's disastrous. You've seen Secretary Panetta say that. You've heard Senator Hagel say that in his testimony before his hearing. They know what's going on. I'll tell you, as I look at what the Air Force will have to do, what the Army will have to do in the reduction of people and equipment, the contracts. See, it is a 9.8% cut against every funded item. So the leadership of our department will not have an option to pick and choose weapon systems or people they'd like to cut. It's 9.8% of everything, and it's spread out over the 10-year period. And a lot of people say, well, that's 10 years, you can afford that. I would tell you this, without sequestration, in other words, if you said, I just need you to take X millions or billions of dollars out of the defense budget, the department could do that methodically over a 10-year period by making good calculated decisions. Now, they wouldn't like to do that, but we would have a better military than an across-the-board 9.8% cut against all programs. And so that's the difference. And it looks like, if you read the news and you watch TV news, that the Republicans and Democrats have sort of pushed away from the table and decided that, okay, I can't win to protect the Department of Defense, and I need you to cut social programs, Democrats. That's Republicans talking to Democrats. So we'll all just back away from the table and play blind man's bluff and just watch what happens. And so that's the way we'll cut social programs, and the more liberal group in Congress says that's the way we'll get it at the Defense Department. It is one of the scariest times in my life to watch what's going on in Washington today. And I'm just sorry that more Americans aren't up in arms, literally, about our representatives who don't get their heads together and cooperate and fix problems for us, instead of the games they're playing. And I mean that in the kindest sense of the word, because they're not getting together. They're not solving this problem, and they're certainly not solving the problem with our Defense Department.
Well, follow up, even if we get some solution to the sequestration and don't have to do that, you know that there are going to be forces wanting to draw down the military anyway. And I worry about China. If we draw down our military very much, that I think is going to be a big problem for us, because once they know they've got the edge, they will start pushing a lot of things that they're not pushing right now. And I think we'll be in real trouble because we won't be able to respond.
I think you're right to be concerned. I've got two perspectives. I can get this real quick for you all. And that is, with regards to China and Russia, the Chinese are more likely to take us on than Russia. But Russia is controlled by Putin, who is very sorry that the Soviet Union collapsed and is now Russia, and they have a vision for becoming the Union again, or something more powerful, and having a play against the U.S. I think if you talk about the potential for conflict, I think the Soviet Union, as it was eager for conflict. The Russian state today, even with Putin, is not easy about head-to-head conflict. We've got a pretty good agreement, understanding amongst us. But what neither one of us understand is what the Chinese are thinking, really, for the long term. And the Asian look towards the future is very, very long term, patient and long term. We as Americans in the Western world want it today, maybe even yesterday. We want satisfaction right now. We want decisions made right now. The Chinese don't worry about right now. They methodically plan for the long term. And you see that in the question about buying up futures. You see that in how they build a military. You see that in how patient they are in almost everything they do. And so that's the potential. So you're right to be concerned. The real threat to America is not those big countries. It is what we see going on today. You know, like the bombing, the suicide bomber in Turkey, the Algerian oil field. It goes on and on and on. So that is the real threat to us as Americans. And we even have to have a responsible military to respond to those kinds of threats. And so sequestration is an idea that is just not good for America. I just say that as an American with some experience in the military and having talk on a routine basis with the friends I have in Washington that are trying to work these kinds of situations. So we've got a tough problem, and unfortunately most of America have their heads in the sand and are thinking about other things right now, not too concerned about it. That's a Washington problem. It's our problem. So it's a good question, Lamar. Yes, sir.
What do you say to the people who say that the military didn't even ask for these increases, so we should do these cuts? And I don't necessarily listen to the liberal side or the conservative side, but I keep hearing that argument several times when we're talking about the fiscal picture and all of that stuff. So did indeed that happen? Is it still going on? Or is that just one more factor?
There's a couple of things. You still have members of Congress, both the House and Senate, will add amendments to the defense bill that makes the department pay for ridiculous stuff. The problem with sequestration is it doesn't allow the Secretary of Defense or any of the chiefs or secretaries of the departments to go in and cut out things they'd like to get rid of. And so my point is, under sequestration, it's a 9.8% cut against all programs.
But that happens in businesses and organizations too. So
I hope not, because you won't pay CEOs to make smart decisions.
But
just put a blinder on and say, just whack the company.
It happens. It happens. I'm not saying it's the best thing, but it does happen. It's not just the military.
What you want to do is encourage people to make cuts that make sense.
I agree.
Right? And that's what I'm saying today is, do something about sequestration. Get rid of it, build a budget, Senate, get it coordinated with the House. From that, you can then make responsible cuts. Just telling you all, if I stood here and said, all right, go home, cut 9.8% out of everything you do in life. You say, wait a minute, I can cut, maybe I won't like it, but if I'm told, I can go home and figure out how to do that and come back with a solution. It's the former of the departments, of all departments of government being asked to do. And so even the social programs, you can't do that to most of the programs that Americans rely on. So I'm not arguing one or the other, I'm just saying do it smart. Sequestration does not do that. And there are billions of dollars of junk in the defense budget put there by senators and congressmen who are just trying to feather their own nest back on. And it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Other than that, I have no opinion whatsoever.